Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with the Armenian Institute, we are the leading Armenian arts and cultural charity in the UK, and we make Armenian history and culture a living experience. AI has one of the most accessible Armenian libraries and archival collections in Europe, and we also host thought-provoking events. We produce podcasts, digital periodicals, and publications on all things related to Armenian culture and history, and of course we also offer Armenian language classes both in Western and Eastern Armenian. We rely heavily on donations and grants and on events like this, so thank you to all of you who have come tonight. I'm Tatiana Avedissian, and I'm Chair of Trustees of the Armenian Institute and your host this evening. We've got the great pleasure of having Gabriel Gavin with us, and his book presentation, Ashes of Our Father, Inside the Fall of Nagorno-Karabakh. It's his first book, and I'm certain not his last one after reading it.
What are you signing me up to?
Gabriel is a journalist and a writer covering Eurasian politics and foreign affairs for Politico in Brussels. His work has appeared in Time magazine, the BBC, The Spectator, The Telegraph, Foreign Policy, and many other leading media outlets. This is his first book. This book was published by Hurst Publishers, our co-organisers for this evening's event, and thank you to them for providing copies of the book, which will be available for purchase later.
At a discount, I believe.
At a discount?
£15 today instead of 20.
Yes, 15 instead of 20, and
cheaper, half the price.
Romanza is your person over there, and she'll help you, and Gabriel will happily sign copies of the book as well. So thank you, Gabriel, for sitting down with us to talk about your book. The history of Nagorno-Karabakh is a long and complicated one, with many nuances, and I'd like to think it's probably one of the messiest conflicts going in the world. Why did you decide to write the book, and let alone make it your first publication?
Masochism, possibly. I think you're right to say it's obviously a hugely complex, incredibly controversial conflict, one where even basic facts feel up for debate at various points, right? I have to say it's deeply humbling to see so many people here. Someone once told me no one turns up to events where authors do it. I'm absolutely astonished that so many of you have, so I'm really grateful. I think probably the sum of knowledge about Nagorno-Karabakh in this room dwarfs mine by many, many, many orders of magnitude. As a journalist, I always say, you're not an expert. I'm very much not an expert. All I am is someone who spent 3 years in the region, visiting, traveling around Armenia, Azerbaijan. I was lucky enough to have, unrivaled access to diplomats, to politicians, to ordinary people, all the way through that. And I think, for me, I wouldn't imagine for a second that many of you actually have had a chance to read the book yet. But I think I start by talking about why I became so interested, and I went on an assignment to do a story following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I was sent to do a story about how that was playing out in Armenia and the kind of changing power dynamics in the region. And there'd been a drone strike in Nagorno-Karabakh a few days before. I think 2 or 3 young boys had died serving in the defense forces. And I went to Goris, and I was in this taxi, couldn't get on the marshrutka, couldn't get the bus, had to hire this guy, and we're driving over the mountains, and I managed to kind of negotiate a rate with him, and he said, well, why are you here? Why do you want to go down to the border? Why do you want to go to the frontier with Nagorno-Karabakh? And I told him, I'm a journalist, I'm here to cover the conflict. And suddenly, he kind of was like, well, you're not paying anything. You just pay for the gas, it's so good that you're here. He'd been fighting in the 2020 war, and out of the glove compartment he pulled his military service card, and he showed me the stamp he'd got when he was conscripted at 18. He showed me the stamp that he'd got when he went to serve in the 2020 war, and he showed me all the space for the potential future stamps for future conflicts yet to break out. And I remember telling my mum actually about everything I was seeing, and she was like, well, are you sure? This isn't on the news here. and I realised that it was a conflict that was being chronically undercovered. And I think I really believed at the time that more coverage, more awareness, more discussion would potentially avoid the kind of violence that both sides had experienced all the way through the last 30 years. I think ultimately I was completely wrong about that. I think lots of people, lots of journalists, lots of activists, lots of officials, lots of politicians really did try to increase the visibility of the conflict all the way through the last few years. And in the full sight of the international community, Nagorno-Karabakh turned into an empty region, devoid of life, devoid of the kind of civic community culture that had been there for as long as anyone can remember. And I think that was, for me, a really kind of harrowing experience. Like, a part of me wanted to write the book to kind of process that and to understand how the narratives that I heard from Armenians, from Azerbaijanis would fit together, and to try and come to terms with how the worst possible fears for Nagorno-Karabakh had come to fruition. I don't think I succeeded very well in kind of processing that. And I mean, when you say, I'm sure I'll do another book, like, God knows, I'm sure Raminta doesn't want to have to try another one. But, it's a deeply difficult thing to do when you're that close to the conflict. You're living in the region, you're speaking to people every day. For the last year of the existence of Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto state, I was speaking to people there every day. I knew what they were having for breakfast, lunch and dinner, which was often not very much. I was as close to it as I think it was possible to be from the outside. And I remember, after when the final assault on Nagorno-Karabakh came and you had this mass exodus of its entire population, I was standing on the border. I was there for about 2 weeks interviewing people coming through, and you had these dump trucks with orphanages being evacuated and kids sleeping under the tarpaulin for 24 hours to get out. And within the space of 2 weeks, I was landing at the airport in Baku and in a hotel room and going to go and interview, the presidential foreign affairs advisor and whatever else. And I remember standing in my hotel room and I had all my notebooks and I had all these documents, and I just thought, I'm never going to be commissioned to write another news story about this. This is never going to be seen again. And I have all this content that I've never been able to talk about in my work as a reporter because it's simply too in-depth. And I felt then, I think, a real sense of obligation to tell those stories. I think they didn't deserve to die in the notebook.
Well, I think, and this leads to something important, which is that it was somewhat luck that, you were in this holding pattern waiting for a visa so that you could, move over to Brussels where you are based now. And we were lucky in many ways because the region got a journalist working for a leading paper being able to report on the ground, and it gave you what's obviously a very deep understanding. A lot of the other journalists, for context, in Armenia, many of them were freelancers, and many of them were struggling to get, to place their content. So it's quite, I think you were in a bit of a unique situation compared to some of your peers.
I like that you've bought into the spin there, because I think people always used to say to me, I can't believe Politico has a South Caucasus correspondent. I was like, yeah, nor can they. They never wanted me in the region. They'd always wanted me to be in Brussels covering politics.
Reporting on conflicts is very challenging anyway, and sometimes you're doing it from London, you're doing it from Paris, wherever you are based, and it doesn't give you that insight, that opportunity to go and speak to the local people that you managed to speak to be able to go and get the high-level interviews, as quickly as you were able to, because, you were lucky, you got interviews on both sides, so you were really getting, the whole picture.
I think that's the real value as well, is that, I really never tried to come into the conflict and tell people how I thought about it, what I thought should be the case, who I thought was to blame for what. All I've tried to do, I think, all the way through is just present the facts, and I think actually it was really valuable to have a bit of an impartial source of information, and I got lots of criticism, I think, from both sides all the way through. So I would, less maybe than others, and maybe less than I deserved. But I would post, for example, I would publicise smashed Azerbaijani graves in Armenia. I would publicise simultaneously the ordeal that was happening to the Karabakh Armenians. And I leave it to people. And I think I say, in the introduction, that it's not up to me to decide what amounts to justice, what amounts to right, what amounts to wrong, and I've really tried to leave that to readers. And I think all I've tried to do is be an impartial source of information. Not impartial to the sense where we say, the Karabakh Armenians say that they're living under blockade, the Azerbaijanis say, well, Nakhchivan is blockaded, which is obviously an absurd position, it's not an equivalent. And I think quite often people who weren't based in the region just didn't have that ability to interrogate those claims. And I think that there's no such thing as neutrality, right? Especially for journalists. I think we should all acknowledge there is no such thing as neutrality. I think all you can be is fair, and I've really tried to be fair. And I think where I have a bias, it's not, I'm a British guy from Oxford, Armenian, Azerbaijani, I have no predisposition to one or the other. Where I have a bias, I think it's in favour of civilians who are affected by conflict and against the politicians who, generation after generation, have failed to resolve those conflicts and have profited from them.
Yeah. And you do talk about that, because I was actually going to ask you a little bit about objectivity. How do you maintain, how do you sort of practice objectivity?
I think in your day job as a reporter, your instincts are just to tell the facts, right? Just to say who, what, where, when, why, and to try and use the most reliable sources and whatever else. I think as a human, you get angry about those things. I think anyone who's watched, the most accessible thing I think for most people is Russia's war on Ukraine, right? Russia's war on the very existence of Ukraine, and seeing the effects of that war, I think, has made a lot of people realise that actually you can't always be objective about these things. You can't draw false equivalences. You can't you can't say you can't play. I think that sometimes I think the most powerful thing is just to tell the unvarnished reality. And I don't think anyone can be objective. And I'm deeply moved by the stories that I've heard from ordinary people on both sides of the border, right? I mean, and do I have a positive opinion of politicians in Armenia or Azerbaijan? Not particularly. Do I have a positive opinion of politicians anywhere? Not so much either. But I think one nice thing about the British media tradition, and I don't think this really got picked up very much before in the former Soviet Union, is I think we have a real instinctive hatred of politicians in the British media. We fund through our license fee, a news organisation that has no problems taking on the British government. The BBC is, and we see that as, I think particularly in Azerbaijan, to some extent in Armenia as well, people see criticism of the state as an act of treason. Journalists who are criticising the leadership, criticising previous decisions, they are persecuted to the end, but also seen as unpatriotic. For me, I think criticising your country is the most patriotic thing you can do. And I think, so for example, I've got colleagues in Kyiv who come under fire for reporting on corruption in their military, and they see that as their patriotic duty, because otherwise you can't crack down on it and you can't win the war. Yeah. Is it worth? Is it worth giving a potted history of the conflict, just briefly, for anyone who doesn't know too much?
And I'm also going to ask you to read a short passage from the book as well. And I'm going to, so
this is where my limited literacy comes.
So I'm going to give you my tattered copy.
Complete with wine stains.
Yes.
You wanted me to read the start of the first chapter.
Yes.
So for anyone who doesn't know, Nagorno-Karabakh was historically Armenian inhabited region that at the end of when the collapse of the Soviet Union found itself inside Azerbaijan's internationally recognized borders, had historically been autonomous. In the 1990s, you had the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Over the region, you saw Armenian forces take control of the entire area, not just of that had historically been Armenian inhabited Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the surrounding area. There was a kind of buffer zone, and you saw, whichever parts of territory changed hands, you saw a mass exodus of people, right? You also saw huge, what people sometimes euphemistically call population transfers from of Azerbaijanis in Armenia and of Armenians in Azerbaijan. And I'm not a historian, I'm not a scholar of this region. I've tried to tell that part of history as far as people need to know. I think pogroms, what about, and read the book. I promise I've detailed it much more considerately and smartly than I can verbally. But obviously you have this torrid history, and then for the best part of the 2 decades that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had Nagorno-Karabakh as this kind of frozen conflict, this region where people, Karabakh Armenians were living out their lives behind a line of fortifications protected by Armenian troops, and meanwhile, Azerbaijan had tried to litigate that as much as possible through the international legal system with no avail. And then in 2020 you have this kind of catastrophic 44-day war that sees the entire buffer zone surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh taken by Azerbaijan, and effectively the Karabakh Armenians dependent on this sole road in and out, the Lachin corridor, the only road through which food, provisions, medicine, people can be moved. And that was placed under the control of Russian peacekeepers, or so-called peacekeepers, who, as part of this trilateral agreement in 2020, vowed to kind of maintain the status quo. And then what you see is, largely, I think, as a result of Russia's shifting interests that have followed the start of the war in Ukraine, you see this absolute reluctance to implement that agreement. You see Azerbaijan consistently pushing on that contact line, taking more and more territory, and then ultimately, from December 2021, cutting off the flow of food, people, and humanitarian aid to Nagorno-Karabakh, the start of a brutal blockade, and then ultimately in September 2023, a final military offensive completely conquered the region, and within 3 or 4 days sparked the exodus of the entire 100,000 ethnic Armenian population. And those people now are, living, the vast majority of them in the Republic of Armenia, the vast majority of them in pretty squalid conditions from what I've seen, facing genuine humanitarian need. A humanitarian need that is not best served, I should say, by the end of US aid funding as part of the current freeze.
Yeah, and actually, just also to add a bit more context to that, which is that Armenia has also received a massive, for those of you that aren't aware, the impact of the war with Russia and Ukraine has also meant a huge group of emigres from Russia, from Belarus coming to Armenia. And it is, putting tension on the infrastructure in the city. I mean, Yerevan is so crowded. When I was there in the summer of 23, I couldn't walk on the pavement. I was like, it's just insane how crowded it is. And I do think that obviously has, there needs to be a lot more investment going into that. So.
This is my least favourite part of anything, is having to read aloud ever since like GCSE English class. So the first 2 chapters of the book start with kind of bringing people up to speed with the 2020 status quo through the eyes of first Armenians, and then in the second chapter through Azerbaijani IDPs. The book, just by virtue of when the period I'm covering, mainly I would say focuses on Armenian voices, because it's about the Fall of Nagorno-Karabakh. I wasn't around to do the reporting 3 decades prior. I wasn't around to do reporting even just before the 2020 war. But I've tried to, I think, juxtapose those 2 voices as much as possible, or 2 sets of voices, because I think the tragedy of Armenians and Azerbaijanis is not how different they are and how close they have to live, but how much in common they have. And I think the sad realization, I think, is that both populations have been dramatically let down at various points by their own leaders and by the international community. And that's not to draw a false equivalence, I think, between the actions of their states, but just in terms of the experience of losing home. So it was early evening, and the sun was already going down behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the city. In the central market, traders packed up their jars of pickles and boxes of walnuts and fresh herbs for the day, while one by one, the windows of the old Soviet apartment building lit up yellow. Across town, Azad Damian was lighting a barbecue. His phone had rung a few hours later. "We're coming to Stepanakert to celebrate our engagement," the voice on the other end said. "Can we do it at your bar?" A single-story cinder block building, Bardak, the only pub in Nagorno-Karabakh, was where the young couple had first met, and they and their guests would need to eat and drink by the time they arrived. Their journey from Yerevan took more than 5 hours, even on a good day. A steady stream of cars and old trucks sputtered along the dusty dual carriageway as it wound its way through the foothills around the Armenian capital, before tracing a course around Lake Sevan, vast and almost unnaturally blue, ice cold even in the hottest weather. It was the end of summer, but the occasional fisherman was still hawking his catch on the roadside, while the stalls along the motorway sold homemade wine and cola bottles filled with bright orange sea butterfly juice made from berries plucked off the bushes that grow wild around the water. As the road arced away from the lake, it passed through the farming village of Sotk, its dirt lanes choked with dogs, chickens and children. Then, picking up pace as they left the houses behind, the cars carrying the bride and groom-to-be crossed the invisible line that was the internationally recognised border. Officially, they just entered the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, but there were no checkpoints, no documents checks or cargo inspections, just the snow-capped mountains of Armenian-controlled Nagorno-Karabakh ahead. On the other side of their peaks, beyond the region's de facto capital, Stepanakert, hundreds of young conscripts and volunteers settled in along the front lines for another night watching the horizon, standing guard over their tiny unrecognised country. Baradak hadn't started out as a proper pub. It had been more of a clubhouse where Azad and his friends, most of them not yet 30, would go to drink and listen to music, roasting potatoes and onions on top of the wood-burning stove. They'd even once barbecued a snake that had found its way onto the property. Everyone agreed that it tasted like fish. But more and more strangers found their way into the bar as this isolated region became an unlikely destination for tourists. Italians, Germans, and Brits who wanted to visit one of the world's few unrecognised states. In his mid-20s, with a thick beard and piercing green eyes, Azad presented the idea of having to run the place as a business, plying visitors with beer, hot meals, and cigarettes on the house, even letting them sleep in the bar overnight if they couldn't find a hotel. For him, hospitality wasn't an industry, but a duty, and foreigners were the least likely to be allowed to put cash in the register. When the evening dragged on too late, all the conversation ran out, he'd head off to bed, handing the keys to one of the regulars to lock up. Tonight was unlikely to earn him much either. When the guests pulled into the parking lot, it turned out they'd already bought their own meat to grill along the way, so they wouldn't be buying his food. But the money didn't matter so much to Azad. Charging his friends on a happy occasion felt dishonourable. And so, before long, the air was filled with the smell of barbecued pork that marks any Armenian celebration. Fatty chunks of meat known as horovats were passed around, piled up high on boards and plates, the juices mopped up with reams of freshly made lavash flatbread, sprinkled with raw onion. Beer flowed from the taps, but an engagement, like any proper party, required the homemade mull-brewed vodka that was one of Nagorno-Karabakh's prized exports. There were 97 people in the tiny pub that night, drinking toasts to the happy couple into the future. Guests danced and sang into the morning. It was the 26th of September 2020. A few hours later, the war started. And from there, you have this existential war over the future of Nagorno-Karabakh. That chapter is entitled The Beginning of the End, because it really was. You had the imposition of a ceasefire agreement that was underpinned by a fundamentally unreliable actor in the form of Russia. And you have an Azerbaijan that effectively saw it couldn't take what it wanted to take by force and was determined to litigate it to the absolute end and challenge that status quo as far as it could.
And thank you for that, because it leads me to my next question. You've managed to delicately and sensitively tell the stories of those who suffered from the conflict, and you even sort of tell stories of people from the First War as well, not just the second one. Why was this important to you? Why did you choose to weave the human story into?
I think it's because it's the only way I know how. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar. There are people in this room who know far more about the conflict than I ever will. All I have been able to do, I think, is speak to people who've been directly affected by that conflict and try to piece together this puzzle. And I think I have to say, I think any book about Nagorno-Karabakh or any book about any conflict, really, it's going to be a bit like trying to watch the story of World War II through CCTV camera footage, right? You can only see the perspectives that you are presented, and therefore it's always going to be a partial picture. And I think I tried to say in the introduction that people are always going to say, well, you write about an Azerbaijani soldier who lost a leg, but what about the Armenian guy who lost an arm? And for that, I can only apologise. I'm never going to be able to build up the full story. And I think, and again, I'm sure people in the room can help with this, but what's needed is more writing on the region. We need more writing on the conflict. We need more perspectives. We need more focus. I would say, to be able to build up that broader picture. And I think we've seen some amazing work in recent years. I don't know if anyone saw My Sweet Land, premiered at the Golden Apricot Festival in Yerevan. Is one example of that. And I think I think to tell a historical version of events, I think, for me, I just wouldn't be able to do it. And I think the entire reason I did this was because of people like Matt. And I found it, again, quite humbling that we've just agreed to do an Armenian translation, and now I'm petrified that some of the people I've spoken to are going to read their stories back, and I'm going to have to answer for that. But it creates a huge amount of responsibility when people tell you their stories, and I've tried to live up to that as best I can.
Well, because I was actually going to ask you, because I read it, and I think you've done a good job of trying to be as fair as possible when you report on it, on the wrongs and the rights. And in many ways, I mean, this is strategy 101, but you cannot learn how to move forward if you don't learn from your past and your mistakes. But I want to ask you, because there's going to be Azeris that read that and not be happy with it, and there's going to be Armenians that read that and not be happy with it.
I'd refer the Azerbaijanis to chapter 2. You know, and I did spend a lot of time speaking to people about their experience on the other side, and I also think that this is I don't mean to put any of you off buying it, but the primary audience of this book was people who know nothing about this conflict. This was supposed to be a primer because I'm not sure that, to my knowledge, exists for complete, you know, the average just generally, you know. I was asked recently who my ideal reader, you know, is it Armenians or Azerbaijanis, and I keep talking about how she'll be delighted when she watches this back. But my mum is my reader. You know, I will always try and write for my mum because she's an intelligent person, doesn't know anything about the region, wants to, you know, has a broad interest. And that was who I really wrote for. So Armenians and Azerbaijanis know their own stories. I think the only thing that this might do is offer them a glimpse of each other.
Because one of the key messages, and you know, that you try to bring forth in this book is actually how much we, as an international community, should be learning from this conflict, because it has been a precursor to a lot of things we're seeing. So, you know, putting aside the military, the changing sort of face of military warfare in you know modern conflicts, but also about how it's sort of helped shape some of the things that have happened since then. Yeah. So whether it's on Ukraine, whether it's what we've seen, what we're actually seeing in Congo, and in fact, yesterday was it yesterday or 2 days ago, my paper wrote an article on how much, you know, world order is being disrupted, and what's happened in Ukraine is affecting what's going on between Rwanda and Congo. So what are the things that you want people to walk away learning?
I think first and foremost, we live in an era where civilians are as on the front line as they've ever been. People, you know, whether you're looking at conflicts in the Middle East, whether you're looking at conflicts in Eastern Europe, you see an abhorrent level of civilian casualties, and I think there is very, you know, when I speak to Ukrainians about this, people feel this genuine sense of disenfranchisement and powerlessness about whether or not people will ever be held to account, and that's something that I've heard in the South Caucasus as well. It's something that I've heard, you know, people talk about when it comes to conflicts like Tigray. So I think that's first and foremost. I also think it's really important, and what this book does try to track as best I can is how hostile actors and authoritarian states are trying to weaken the international order. And I think one of the things that was kind of, I think, the most painful to hear was when people, you know, speaking to people as they left Nagorno-Karabakh, looking behind them at, you know, their mountain and their homeland, the place they'd have fought and died for probably the last time. People said, you know, well, we never trusted the Russians. We never thought that Russia was going to be a reliable partner. Maybe we thought we could play them off and we could manage, and you know, they'd buy us some time. But we know what their deal is. You know, we always knew they were out for themselves. They wanted to station their troops here. They wanted to do whatever for their own reasons. The true betrayal that many people felt was that actually a Western world order that had told them we care about humanitarian values, we care about, you know, the right to self-determination, we care about the protection of civilians. They didn't feel that had been upheld, and I think that's obviously a tragedy. It's a revert. In the case of where the system is moving, you know, it's one that can be fixed. You have to hope it can be fixed, and I think Nagorno-Karabakh shows what happens if that doesn't change. And I think we, you know, I certainly the policymakers that I've spoken to since writing this book, there is an increasing awareness about the need to be more kind of assertive when it comes to international law, when it comes to effectively the system of governance, insofar as we have an international community. And there was just simply, you know, principles, red lines were just crossed time and time and time again with no consequence. And I think that's something that has to change. It's something we're also seeing in the Middle East.
Well, we saw it in Syria.
Yeah, or Israel-Palestine. You know, I mean, I think it's no secret, and I'm not sure anyone or any side of the conflict would challenge the idea that things that have been laid out as red lines by the UN or by the US or whoever have been crossed time and time again.
So you actually reminded me of something, because I thought it was quite funny that you cover Samantha Power's visit to Armenia. Then you also you sort of asked Yuri Kim a question, and she had been sort of dismissed for, I guess, not towing or misspeaking on behalf of the Biden administration.
Well, so this was an interesting one because during the mass exodus from Nagorno-Karabakh, Samantha Power, who was the US aid administrator at the time, she was sent as the White House's envoy to Armenia. She's also, prior to taking on that role, she'd written a book called A Problem from Hell about how the US stood by and allowed genocides to happen, focusing actually primarily on the Armenian genocide of 1915. And I couldn't help but, it was me and my friend from Reuters jostling for a question, and we kind of managed to go, okay, 1, 2, I'm sure I had the first one, and I just couldn't help but ask, you're in this, people always, we're obviously not anywhere near people who deserve to be felt sorry for, but it's painful for journalists just doing these jobs because you're sleeping for 4 hours a night, you're doing all this harrowing stuff, then you're also in physical discomfort in the same pair of clothes that you've had on for a week. Kneeling on the rocky floor with my, in a stress position with my dictaphone above my head, and I'm trying to think, what do I ask her? What do I ask Samantha Power? And I kind of called out, having written the book on ethnic cleansing, surrounded by people who've lost their homes, are you in a position to say that's what this is? And it's kind of an unfair question in some ways because obviously the way that administrations decide these questions is not someone goes to the border and they off the top of their head pull out a line, but she just didn't have a message prepared on that. And we saw this is a book of character arcs. People like Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, people like Azerbaijani leader Ilham Aliyev. There's character arcs here, and I think for Samantha Power there was this really rapid and very sad character arc where she went from being someone who said the US doesn't call out genocides to being someone who said, well, we have to have access and we have to decide. And you just, I'm not sure I would have been able to do anything different if I'd have been in her shoes, but it was just this truly absurd moment where you just thought, what are we doing here? Why come and show your support for something when you don't have a clear government position on what this is?
And maybe it's also less that some people shouldn't go into politics if you can't hack them. Because I actually wrote, I used her when I was writing my dissertation.
I felt quite sorry for her. It's my job to ask hard questions, but again, it's about the disdain we have for politicians, I think.
So I do want to, because talking about Samantha, there was a lot of obviously frenzy in September 23 and what came. And you actually cover this as well, and I think you do it quite beautifully as well, where you sort of highlight this, the complete absence of media for the last, 2 years since the conflict. Very little reporting on the blockade, apart from whatever was sort of coming through piecemeal. And then, of course, it's the exodus and the ethnic cleansing, and suddenly there's journalists, there's press sites being set up near the border. They're all just taking lots of time. You do talk about this, and you also express your, I guess, is it disdain or disappointment? How did you feel when you were seeing, Wall Street Journal, all these different journalists there?
I think I was glad that they were there. I know plenty of colleagues of those outlets who. Really pushed to spend more time in the region, who wants to do these stories. I think there's an inevitable problem that you have, which is that people just do not know where the South Caucasus is. I was speaking to an Azerbaijani girl once, and she said she'd been on an exchange here to the US, and someone had said, where are you from? She said, Azerbaijan. And they went, where's that? And she went, well, it's between Russia and Iran. And they went, oh my God. And I'm sure with many Armenians in the room, how many times have you been mistaken for Albanians? Or Romanians. There is a fundamental lack of general knowledge about the region, which makes it much harder to try to explain to people about why it matters. And I think that does just derail the amount of editorial interest that you get as a reporter. I really had to make the case for every story I did on the conflict, and I know plenty of other people try to do the same with their editors. I also think that I don't blame them for a second for not being there until they were there. I think many of them would have wanted to be before. It's just the nature of the way that the media works now. It's really difficult to do that. And I was in a really uniquely lucky position because I was lying to my employer about how long it took to get a Belgian visa. But also, I think the other thing I felt largely was just a sense of disgust about the nature of covering conflicts, and I think I'd really started hoping that that coverage, as I said, would change the eventual outcome and could moderate this and could attract more kind of international involvement. And then, I'm suddenly there and I'm speaking to people who've, fled their homes, left everything behind, I'm going to go away, I'm going to write a story, my editor's going to tell me that's great colour. I'm going to go away, write a book and, get reviews. So I think I felt and still feel quite a lot of disgust about the nature of covering the conflict. Although I'm deeply glad that there are people around to do it. I'm glad that I was able to be in a position to do that for a while.
So, technical question, how hard was it to go from recording to writing a book, which is somewhat fiction, non-fiction?
I think the intro is pretty dense. I would say the rest is like I've tried to go for something like narrative non-fiction, where I tell people stories in a way that is hopefully, touch wood, nice to read. I'll let you be the judge. I think I conceptualized it originally really naively as like, I'm like, well, 100,000 words, like that's like 100 news stories, How hard can that be? And way harder than I imagined, way harder. And I think I was really lucky that I'd been kind of obsessed with the conflict for a period of 3-4 years, and I had kind of a lot of the information at my fingertips. I also just praised whatever power that be that I actually kept quite good notes, and I had recordings and I had documents set up on my computer and transcripts and things, which was really uncharacteristic for me. I was really grateful that when I came back, I'd done some of that prep work. But I also think you're doing a different thing in a book to what you're doing in a news article, because you have to build a sense of momentum. You have to tell a story fundamentally, and I try and tell quite a few stories in this. Whereas in a news article, you just aren't telling a story. You're just stating the facts. And I really wanted. I really wanted it to be something that people would read out of interest rather than out of obligation like you read the news. It's not just because you need to know the facts. I want people to be able to read it and get a sense of different people's narratives all the way through the last 30, 40 years. And
what do you think lies ahead for the region? Is this the final fall? What do you make of the peace negotiations?
I mean, I might nominate growers, but I think the South Caucasus is a uniquely difficult time for various reasons. I think there's never been so much interest in the South Caucasus, even just intuitively, even just reading the Guardian travel pages. People have never been as interested in the South Caucasus as they have been. And you have more and more powers kind of rushing into this breach. You have, a Russia that's interests are massively realigning, and its dependencies are massively realigning when it comes to needing allies for sanction circumvention or bringing in, or exporting its fossil fuels or whatever it might be. You have Turkey that is absolutely intent on becoming a regional power. It is a regional power, becoming more than a regional power potentially. You have, Iran, which is doing Iran things, and facing huge uncertainty with President Donald Trump. And I think, I'm being a bit facetious, but I mean, Iran is a book I'm not. I'm extremely unqualified. I mean, not that I was particularly qualified to write this one, but just incredibly complex. You have India getting involved. You have, what's going on in Georgia? Nothing good. And you have this massive realignment throughout the region. Every major player in the world is interested in what is happening in the South Caucasus now. And at the same time, you have these kind of. Again, it comes back to me about characters. You have this president. You have President Ilham Aliyev, this kind of bombastic, mustachioed, authoritarian leader who goes from having the humiliation of his father having failed to secure the entirety of their country's internationally recognised borders. This humiliation. And he goes on his personal journey to kind of triumph in his mind. And then you have Nikol Pashinyan, this man who started off as this kind of nasal-voiced, pot-bellied revolutionary, walking up and down the country, shaking everyone's hand, just being kind of like, a kind of barefoot, itinerant monk, who eventually becomes, this guy who's sitting in his government building behind a row of riot police, watching, another man Bagrat Sarbazan, like walking across the country with his bloodied feet, railing people against him. You live kind of long enough to be the thing that you once campaigned against, I guess, is to badly misquote Christopher Nolan films. And I think these stories are playing out at the heart of a really explosive geopolitical situation. And I think what's really interesting about the Pashinyan case is that, from what I can tell and from what I've spoken to, and I've interviewed him several times, and I think I have a good understanding of what his inner team think, they really have faith in this idea of the international order. They really have faith that they think the biggest problem that they had was that there was ambiguity over the status of Karabakh, and that they never managed to square off the kind of irregularities, the international law side. That was the problem as they diagnose it. And I think their view is that if there are no grey areas, no legal grey areas, then if you have internationally recognised borders, then the international community has to protect those. It's not happened in the Donbass. It's not happened around Germany. But that's why it's a test, in my mind, of whether the international order is going to live up to its name. Because if you're going to have territorial integrity, if you're going to have, Armenia has made astonishing strides when it comes to this stuff. You've got a freezing of membership of Russia's CSTO military alliance. You've got the dispatching of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. You've got, nobody should be under any doubt that while there are huge problems with Armenia's democracy, it's moved in an astonishing direction for a post-Soviet country outside of the Baltics. You've got media freedom that the people in neighbouring Georgia could only dream of, not that they'd ever commit it.
Well, and actually, this is something as well that that there's a lot that happened after the First War, and what led Azerbaijan down, post-Soviet into what is now an authoritarian regime. And Armenia is probably one of the last democracies in the region. And it could have gone down.
It's the only democracy in the South Caucasus.
Yeah, with Georgia in the way that it is at the moment, that's a fair point. Armenia could have gone in a completely different direction, because after war, things can change, but it hasn't. And I think that's quite significant.
Yeah, hold your horses. It still might turn for the worse. I think what would be the real tragedy? Once an Armenian official once said to me, he said, the battle between Armenia and Azerbaijan is a battle between democracy and autocracy. And I said, it's nonsense. The most popular thing you could do in the freest of all Azerbaijani presidential elections is say, we're going to take back Nagorno-Karabakh and we're going to hound the Armenians. That would have been a complete, barnstorming speech. And he went, no, you misunderstand me. He was like, the conflict is a battle between autocracy and democracy in Armenia. Having marched everyone up the hill and said, the West will protect us if we do these things, for us to lose that argument, for us to be let down, weakens our ability to be able to say to the people who say, well, no, we have to have an autocracy, we have to put security first, we have to crack down on traitors, which is a message that's been used very effectively in Azerbaijan. And it's a message that's been used very effectively in Russia. It's a message that's being increasingly used in Georgia. And I think we are seeing that authoritarian wave. And I do think, I think the real tragedy, one of the many tragedies would be for Armenia to go through all this process and then to lose its democracy and its freedom as well. I have to be very careful talking about Armenian politics because, again, I'm not an expert. I'm also not an Armenian. I don't vote in the country. It's not my livelihood. It's not my life. But I would say that there's always sometimes a tension between people who live in the country and people who don't. And I think one of Armenia's greatest strengths as a country, as a society, as a culture, is its diaspora. Look at who's organising tonight, or the church just around the corner. It's absolutely astonishing. But I think sometimes there's a different set of priorities when it comes to things. So I was in Glendale last summer, and I spent a lot of time talking to America Hyde, and the biggest thing that people said was, well, we have to be strong, we have to take on the Azerbaijanis, we have to be unafraid, we have to stand at the border. And you think, well, you're not at the border. your kids won't be at the border. And then you go to some village in the middle of nowhere in, I was in Ararat Mars, and I was waiting on the street to meet the local, village mayor. And these guys come along and they're like, who are you? And I was a journalist. They're we've got a story for you. And I was like, oh God, here we go. And they were like, we are now collecting wood to build a sculpture of Prime Minister Pashinyan because of all he's done for our village. And you think, wow, this is like 2024. The guy's lost 2 wars. The region of Nagorno-Karabakh is gone. And people are building a wooden sculpture to the Prime Minister. I can't think of that happening in any other country or comparable situation. But when you speak to people about why, it's because, there wasn't a road to the village before, and the corrupt mayor was taking everyone's cash and not building anything. And then actually Pashinyan comes in and there's a road. And you don't have to pay kickbacks to the mayor, and your brother's not being shaken down for his business, and actually the economy's going quite well. And then you ask people, what about Karabakh? And they say, this means that we can support our brothers and sisters from Karabakh more effectively. And I think those are the kind of perspectives that aren't often communicated. I mean, when I speak to people from in Glendale, not everyone obviously, but a significant proportion of people, they're like, I don't know anyone who supports Pashinyan. And you think, I don't know anyone in Ararat Mars who doesn't, So it's a really difficult one, and I think there's, as much as there's a kind of difference in perspectives between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, there's also plenty of different perspectives inside those groups themselves.
Yeah, but I think that's healthy. I do think that's healthy.
And it's very healthy that people can write about this stuff and debate about this stuff, and by and large, people have the freedom to be able to do it, and I think that's.
And again, you do, because your book is very comprehensive, because you do capture a lot of these sort of nuances, as I mentioned earlier, and that issue of not all Armenians from Armenia had a positive view on Nagorno-Karabakh, and that is a reality. And I experienced that on my first trip to Armenia. I was quite taken aback because I was that diaspora who had, learned of the story in a different way. I do want to touch on.
On that, even in Armenia, I was speaking to a Karabakhsi friend recently, and she was saying that she'd moderated her use of Karabakhsi Barbar, like a Karabakh dialect and everything else, because she'd been in a taxi and the guy had just started mocking her for her accent. And we've all had to suffer because of Karabakh, and that's a perspective that exists in Armenia, and I think there's varying shades of that perspective. I think it's really sad when people, through no fault of their own, are in that position. But I think this is clearly something there's never any consensus around, which makes it really hard to write a book about.
And I do have to say that there is. And some of you have been to Armenia in the last few years, but for those of you that haven't, you go there and you do see the trauma is real. And not only, the Karabakhs, you mentioned in your acknowledgements, Siranush, a wonderful young freelance journalist, and people like her, she's got a story to tell and experiences, but not many people want to hear those stories in Armenia. I do want to, because I'm going to open it up to everyone. How can, obviously right now there's the issue of the POWs, there's the trials, there's the sham trials going on at the moment, there's a lot of cultural erasure going on, you do talk about some of that in the book. Is there a way, like from your own personal observations, how can we kind of take a step back from all of this? Or is it just, are we going to end up with a Natajivan in Nagorno-Karabakh?
I think it's really difficult to see a situation where anybody on any side of this conflict gets justice in any meaningful way. And I think one of the things that I really try to do is explain how actually the conflict is far more unjust, maybe, than even seems the case from the outside. So, I remember going to a village in the territory that had been taken in 2020, speaking to Azerbaijani IDPs who'd returned, and being told, well, I used to have a job in Baku, and now I don't, and I can't afford groceries, and I can't afford, and the government doesn't give me very much, and I can't work, and my kids are hungry, and I don't know what to do. And you think, well, these are the people for whom you're buying all this weaponry. These are the people for whom young men are going to go and die. But if you're not interested in giving them work, or you build this kind of Potemkin village for journalists to come and see, then what's it really about? And I think sometimes you get these kind of like state narratives. It's about, and I watch people kind of fall into it as a discourse all the time where it's, well, you did this, well, you did this, and it goes back and forth. When actually I think some of the most powerful way for me to kind of, I think, to subvert that narrative is always about saying, well, actually, you're kind of victims of the same thing in many cases. You actually have a lot in common in how you've been let down and how your struggle has been abused and everything else. I think there is no question of, I think there is very little question of the chance for justice for the Karabakh Armenians. I think there's very little question of justice for Karabakh Azerbaijanis. I mean, no one has been served well by this outcome. And I think, there are, of course, the war that happened in the 90s was red in tooth and claw as it was a truly brutal conflict. And you absolutely can, I think, there have been conflicts that are similar. You mentioned the trials in Baku, for example, and actually I went to the trial of a Karabakh Armenian who'd been detained, abducted from the border checkpoint and taken and put on. And from what I've seen of international trials, which is not very much, you have photos, you have forensic evidence, you have whatever else, you have whatever you can. And this was just a series of denunciations, right? And there are people who committed war crimes in the 1990s. There are people who committed war crimes in the period since. How confident are you that those are the people on trial? How confident are you that even if they are, they're being prosecuted for the right reasons in a way that's acceptable to international community?
They lie a lot. How do you know they're telling you the truth? They look at you and lie, your identity, everything about you. They reimagine you.
Yeah. And this is the great difficulty. Is I think that justice is a really notional term, right? And an international tribunal for Armenia and Azerbaijan in the way that had happened in Yugoslavia. I mean, is that practical? Is that possible? I have no idea. I'm not a legal expert. But what we're seeing play out in Baku right now is not that. It's very far from that. And I think it's really interesting to see that you've got 15 former Karabakh Armenian leaders being tried together, and then Rupen Vardanyan being tried separately. And Vardanyan was, 9 months in a civilian role, and he's the kind of great Satan in the eyes of the state. And I think it's worth questioning why that is. Is Rupen Vardanyan, Mother Teresa? Probably not. But why is the judicial process, which nobody believes, as far as I can tell, in Azerbaijan is free and fair? Why is it being used to target these people when there are people who fought in the 90s, Karabakh Armenians, who Azerbaijan has previously said were directly responsible for war crimes, maybe to some degree, with some degree of accuracy, who were allowed to leave Nagorno-Karabakh as part of those deals, as part of that. And actually they would just, so again, it's about, justice has nothing to do with any of this.